Okay, everybody, this video is going to be different from the other ones because in addition to reviewing a couple of the videos that you looked at, I'm also going to be going through some PowerPoint images, kind of make up for a lecture I would normally give in my on-campus classes. So the first one is a little bit of the imagery you saw regarding Henry Fox Talbot. And if you remember in this video, one of the problems with the positive-negative process that Talbot created is that he's using a paper negative. And of course, paper, like you see this image right here, didn't allow for the same kind of clarity that a daguerreotype did. Daguerreotypes were at incredible detail, whereas the paper negative was a softer image. One of the things to keep in mind about the history of photography, like any technology, is that once it's invented, then people start to tinker with it and improve it. And so here you see this gentleman using the wet plate collodion process, which was an improvement on the paper negative. So rather than using a substrate that was only translucent, it would let light through, but the texture of the paper came through in the image. The wet plate collodion process was invented. Here you see him putting it in a bath to sensitize the plate with the silver nitrate. The collodion substance is a mixture of methyl cellulose and ether, two very flammable substances. Of course, it made for a much more detailed negative. Plastic wasn't around at that point, so glass was a natural choice for a transparent substrate. Of course, you have some downsides to that. Glass is, of course, fragile. When you get several pieces of glass together, it gets very heavy very quickly. One of the challenges really for early photographers who used this wet plate collodion process is that you would have had to make that negative right before using it. You couldn't make a bunch and store them and use them later. You had to make the negative and shoot the image. So here you see that he set up this van with a kind of mobile darkroom so he can photograph this gentleman, process the negative right there on the spot. It's hard to imagine photographers in the 19th century having to go out in a vehicle like this, loaded down with chemicals, water, a few dozen glass plates, and going out to shoot. Ambitious photographer might get a dozen images shot in a day, whereas today, of course, you could take hundreds. When I taught photography classes here at West Georgia, I would require students to shoot at least 100 images per assignment. So technology has certainly changed over time. Something else to point out too, the video that I was just showing you, the gentleman's making what he calls an ambrotype. This is an ambrotype. The interesting thing about that process is that depending on the substrate that you put it on, it could either act as a negative or as a positive. So here you see an ambrotype negative because that material, the wet collodion and the silver nitrate, was put on a piece of clear glass. An option, though, was to either put that same solution on a piece of black glass or put a black background behind the clear glass when you're done, and it makes the image appear as a positive. So here's a ambrotype in a case. Looks really similar to the daguerreotypes and the kind of decorative cases that they had, popular at the time. Another thing is that while these cases are attractive, this image is covered with a piece of glass, so it was somewhat fragile itself. Another process that was invented in the mid-19th century was the tintype. And if you think about it, it's very similar to what I just showed you with the ambrotype, because the substrate for this is a piece of tin, a piece of metal, with a black coating on top of it. You can see on the corners here the black coating. And then the light sensitive emulsion is put on the plate and it's exposed, so you get a one-of-a-kind positive image. One of the things I like to point out in my class too, the reason why I like to show this particular image, because here's an example of middle class African Americans in the middle of the 19th century. So this perhaps was taken even before the Civil War, which would tell me that these were African Americans that lived in the northern part of the United States. Like most people back then, they didn't have closets full of clothes like we do now. They might have 3 or 4 changes of clothes, including their Sunday best that they would have worn to have a portrait made of themselves. Another thing that's really hard for us to imagine too, though, is that photography was a very democratizing kind of medium. Before photography was around, very few people could afford to have a portrait of themselves made, a painted or drawn portrait. The only affordable type of portrait would have been the silhouette portraits like you saw in the George Eastman House videos. So a family like this, after the invention of photography, is able to have an affordable portrait of themselves made. Here's the camera that was used to make a tintype. You can see that it had a slider. You put the piece of tin in, slide it into the camera, expose the shot, open a little slot in the bottom here you see, and the piece of tin would drop into a container of solution that it would develop in. One of the things I think is interesting about this is that when you think about it, it's pretty reminiscent of the Polaroid camera that didn't come around for another 100 years, because the picture develops inside the camera. Here's an ad for a company selling these tintype cameras, and women in the audience. I think this is a telling and humorous kind of image, because the ad is saying that this process is so simple, even a woman can do it. So definitely a 19th century Victorian sensibility. Remember that this was around the time of women's suffrage. Women didn't even have the right to vote in the late 19th century. Here's that photographic van again. This could have been a tintype maker, could have been someone doing the wet collodion process, but just give you an idea of the kind of transportation involved in the 19th century. Another fad that came in the 19th century was stereo cards and stereo viewers, or stereoscope. So here's a camera that has 2 lenses on it, so it takes 2 pictures simultaneously, but notice that these are configured much like your eyes. And of course, anybody that's been laying around bored and looked through one eye and then closed the other eye and then switched back and forth, that we see the world from just slightly different points of view with each eye. Put those 2 images together, it gives you a much greater sense of depth. So stereo cards were a really great way, and there's of course no way to show this in a presentation, but cards like these could be put in a viewer that I'll show you here in just a second. The viewer combined the 2 images into one and gave it a very 3-dimensional appearance. Notice that these images are very similar, but just from slightly different points of view. So look at that guy's head over here. It's getting chopped off a little bit. If you look at it over here, it's not. Same thing with this guy's backpack. There's a little bit of space there. There's no space there. So here's the viewer. You put the card in the viewer, slide it back and forth to focus it, and there's actually a space, a divider in the middle of this that you can't see. So it would essentially combine the 2 images into one and made a very convincing 3-dimensional image. These were hugely popular in the Western world. And remember, this is before radio, this is before television. So these really were the visual entertainment for the home in the 19th century. Millions of these were made in the first years after they were invented, so it was a huge fad. And think of it this way, by looking at cards of different places in the world, seeing cultures that you've never seen before, it really created some things that we have gotten accustomed to. So think of it, this is the 19th century Discovery Channel. Another trend in the 19th century was visiting cards. inventors of this idea were the French, so carte de visite. Imagine a combination of a business card and a portrait. And people would give them out the way a businessman would give out a business card. If you were trying to make a name for yourself, it was a good way to get the word out. So here, this guy sitting here had visiting cards made during his first term prior to getting reelected to a second term. And historians believe that his success in getting reelected was in part due to the fact that he used a visiting card, whereas his opponent did not. Another population that used visiting cards was rich and famous. It was a way to cultivate a reputation in rich society or as an entertainer. So think about this. This is an important thing that I want to stress by showing you these images, is that you're looking at the 19th century precursors to many of the things that we take for granted now. Visual media used to get your name out, to get your face out. Visiting cards were much like our Facebook today. Of course, another use of photography, hopefully none of you have one of these, is the mugshot, originally called the Bertillon card after this man. So this is the man who came up with the idea of the mugshot, Alphonse Bertillon, his wife and child. Of course, his child did not commit any crimes. Original Bertillon cards really contained a lot of information. In addition to height, weight, would include eye color. Sometimes people would even take measurements of a person's face and include that in this information. One thing to keep in mind is that this is photography being used different populations in different kinds of ways. If we go back to the previous image, visiting cards, a use of photography for the rich and influential. Mugshots, photography being used often for people of less advantage. And the last subject I really want to touch on is about this modest looking little box. So this was Kodak camera, produced by George Eastman Company in 1888. The front of this box was about 4 by 6 inches. Get an idea of the size of it. So this is a camera that's much smaller than the one you saw in the video about wet plate collodion photography. That plate was probably 11 by 14 inches. You saw him use a large view camera, the kind of camera where you have to put the black cloth over your head, has the big bellows on it. So a camera like that and those glass plates were, as you can imagine, difficult to transport around. So the invention of the Kodak camera was a huge leap in technology. It's smaller, therefore it's more portable, and the real innovation is that this box was loaded with flexible roll of film. Plastic still didn't exist. It was made out of cellulose, which had its drawbacks because it was flammable, but it allowed the photographer to take multiple shots without having to reload the camera, and a pretty amazing innovation for the time. You didn't unload the film and take it out. You simply mailed the box back to the Kodak company. They processed the film and sent the pictures, and if you wanted it back, load another roll of film in and mail it back to you. But I want to show you a couple of last shots here. I like showing this shot because it's the steamer Chattahoochee. But here's an example of what that little box camera can do for you. It allows you to go places that would have been much more difficult to get to with a big view camera and glass negatives. So climbing up the rigging of a ship and photographing it. And this one last image seems kind of modest, but there's some things about it that I think are really important, and again kind of tells you about what innovations in the technology can do to the art of photography. Because here's a picture that appears to be taken out of the back of a moving train. So for one thing, another place that a large view camera couldn't have gone. The train's moving, it's in pretty rough terrain. And another thing about this, it's subtle but important, is that the view of this image is just slightly tilted, and it's a asymmetrical composition. This kind of gives you an idea that this smaller box camera allows you to be more dynamic in the way you're composing images. Even something as subtle as tilting the camera slightly or creating this more dynamic asymmetrical composition really comes with the little Kodak camera.